Hello and welcome to this video on the historical production of beer. Beer has always been a part of society in many countries with a substantial grain agriculture element. Historically, it varied wildly between a home-based product and something of an industrial good. The medieval period is an example of beer primarily as a homemade product, but something that was emerging into the industrial evolution of products of the time, a change in culture, beer being just one part of this. Beer was an important part of the medieval period. It provided a safe source of drinking water, sustenance, and was believed to have some medicinal qualities. While water was still consumed more commonly than beer, it was still important across all social strata, from the lowest peasantry to the highest nobles. Beer was one of the most common drinks during the Middle Ages and consumed daily. Everybody would consume it in the northern and eastern parts of Europe. These are parts of Europe where grape cultivation was difficult or not possible at all. This compares to parts of the Mediterranean, France, Spain, and North Africa, where grapes could be grown more readily. Even in these regions where wine was more readily available, and as a result cheaper, beer was still almost preferred, if it was not more popular, among the lower strata. This owes to a range of factors, but primarily the fact that it could be made at home. Beer as we know it today includes things like hops, but hops weren't an original inclusion, and were in fact a much later addition. They really only occur in the records sometime around the 9th century. The change to include hops was down to a range of factors, but the big one was that it took a long time for hops to become an accepted incorporation into the standard list of ingredients. You also have to account for the fact that it took a long time for hops to spread as a product. It was something made or used right across Europe and then incorporated into beer. It took a long time for it to spread that far and find usage. If you don't have the right amount of hops added to everything else in your beer, it can ruin it. And this is why it was incorporated and used very slowly. It wasn't until roughly the 13th century that beer became established as part of some of the medieval towns, particularly those in Bohemia. Bohemia is now part of Germany. It was part of a larger social movement to standardization, whether that was the ingredients, which we can now see in the Reinheitsgebot, German beer purity laws, barrel sizing, the amount that's being bought and sold for a specific sum of money. Many things were being, if not standardized, then legislated so that you would know what you were getting and to ensure the quality was there. Part of the need for this was driven by the social movement away from the home-based production of beer, which had existed for the last 7 to 9 centuries in Europe, and likely even earlier than that, through to the small-scale industrial operations that had between 8 and 10 people, sometimes more, frequently as few as 3. The increase in production allowed beer, and particularly hops, to spread from mainland Europe across to Flanders and then through to England itself. In England, we only see beer appearing as we know it today, incorporating hops and similar, in the late 15th century. At the same time, we also see England bringing out rules regarding how beer is to be made, or more specifically, that you could either brew beer or ale, no brewer being allowed to create both of the products. This distinction was important to the English, and it owes to how they define the two products. Beer was seen as something that included the gruit or herbs and spices, whereas ale is what had hops added to it. As said, there was an increasing movement across this period to have rules and structure around beer. This is how important it was to people at the time. There were punishments if you weren't following the correct procedures, content, or selling things that weren't as described. If your beer was too weak, or you used materials such as hops and added them to an ale or to a beer. If you were using the wrong ingredients in the wrong way, or in many cases, as was the instance with bread, if you were to sell a smaller amount than what you had paid for. For instance, bakers were notorious for taking a small amount of dough from every loaf and creating an extra loaf out of this amount. This was almost like skimming from the top, and was something that could be punished if they were discovered doing so. In a similar manner, because beer was almost as important as bread at this time, if a brewery was selling a smaller volume than what was paid for, they could be severely punished. At this time, you also had an increasing utilization of women in the workforce, specifically within brewing. This was because there was a close relationship between the domestic tasks of normal household life and brewing, as the industrial production was largely just an extension of what was done in the home. The fact that the women were more familiar with cooking and food production meant that they had the experience and knowledge to create a safe, reliable product. This knowledge was largely going to be needed for more industrial-sized brewing. It needed a lot of money compared to the requirements for household brewing. This paid for equipment, grains, people, and all the things that were necessary to get beer from where it was made to where it was going. If you were looking at making beer in your home at this time, you weren't going to need any of this, but you did need the same knowledge. The home brewer would make their beer in a manner that was not so different to what we're familiar with today. There were some key differences, but overall it was still very similar. The home brewer would be able to get away with equipment that they already had, and most of this was already being used for food production anyway. It would largely include a large pot in which they would cook their mash, a large bucket in which they would conduct their fermentation, and perhaps a lid of some sort. And that was all they needed. There were no fancy airlocks or similar structures and devices used today. And for this reason, among others, their beer would not only be flat, but also the amount of sugar involved would be more. In fact, their ingredients overall would be somewhat different to what we're familiar with today. Looking at the English beers to start with, the process of producing malt at this time was not particularly refined. They would be using kilns, and malt would come out rather dark, in fact, exceptionally dark. This produced something very similar to a bitter or lager in modern terms. Quite a harsh flavour compared to what you might think of as a normal go-to beer. This owes to how dark the malt would be, because they could not control the process properly. They could get it reasonably accurate, but there was always going to be deviation. Another thing they did was that they would use their grain and their malt to get multiple extractions. The first of these were called their first runnings, and that's what made the high gravity fermentation. When you look at the approximate alcohol by volume, you get about 10%. This is your potent, drinking, intoxicating beer. The second run would be substantially weaker, and then they produce something about 3% alcohol by volume. This is sometimes called a small beer. That would be something that would be able to be stored more effectively than your water and similar sources, or even the final third runnings. These were a weak beer, and sometimes called table beer. It had flavour to it, similar to flavoured water, but it didn't have the ability to be stored anywhere near as effectively as the beer with alcohol in it. As a result, it had a much shorter storage life and had to be consumed very quickly. The production of it was also somewhat more difficult, primarily because they were relying on wild yeast and sometimes bacteria. At least in the early medieval period, there was a good chance that the wild inoculation would contain both yeast and bacteria to some extent. Think of the difference in flavour between a modern sourdough and regular bread. That's similar to what you would be seeing in their beer. Over time, they would get more adept at creating a pure yeast culture. One of the ways this would happen is through recycling of the equipment used. Continuing to reuse buckets in which they had already conducted a fermentation would help to inoculate it with even more wild yeast. The beer itself would be made with much more sugar than we're used to using today. That's because these dark malts didn't have the ability to be converted into fermentable saccharides as effectively as what we have today. This means they would add a lot more malt to their fermentation, and it's one reason why they're able to run multiple extractions more effectively. If you were to pour a glass of beer from this period, you might be quite surprised, and unpleasantly so. It would have been very murky and cloudy. At this time, or at least throughout most of this period, lagering wasn't a thing. This would have meant that the beer had a lot of protein and yeast left in it. It would have been quite cloudy and, for some, quite unpleasant looking. They didn't have an effective means of removing it. Cold crashing simply wasn't a thing. They did have some other options though to compensate for it, and this was often based on regional variations where beers were further flavoured with fruits and sugars. The fact is these were wildly varying between regions, and you might go from one to the other at different times of the year and experience very different outcomes. Most homemade beer as it is, or ale more accurately, was generally consumed extremely quickly. This is because there was that initial addition of bacteria and yeast. Even with later changes to it, and the incorporation of more yeast, they didn't have the means of storing it in a way that would have kept it sanitary and safe in the long term. The volume they produced would have been relatively small for this reason, maybe 5 to 10 litres depending on how much was being made at a time and how large their household was. Gradually, hops were incorporated more aggressively, and this is what eventually led to the Indian Pale Ale as we know it. That was a beer made largely to facilitate its consumption going all the way from Europe across the Atlantic Ocean, all through to India. It needed to be kept for months, and that was partially facilitated by those hops. The long-term consumption of beer has had an effect on the genetics of those people in Europe who consumed it, and their descendants. If you have a household which has the children through to the elderly consuming beer daily, and in fairly large quantities, they're going to begin finding ways to adapt to it. In a lot of Westerners, you'll find that there is something called acetaldehyde dehydrogenase. This is a particularly useful enzyme that helps to remove a lot of metabolic byproducts from the consumption of alcohol. When you look at indigenous peoples in Australia, America, and a lot of Asia, they don't have this enzyme. Their populations, for the most part, historically haven't had as ready and large-scale access and consumption of alcohol, like beer. This is going to demonstrate just one thing that occurs and how important it was to the medieval period, particularly in Europe. It literally changed the genome of the entirety of Europe and gave them the ability to better handle their alcohol. The growing popularity throughout the medieval period comes to an end as we get towards the Renaissance and into that. Despite this, places like the alehouse, tavern, and inn continue to act as an important place despite this. They would be a social centre. The beer brewed and served would be important in feast days and similar phenomena. The person who brewed it would be considered an important individual simply because of how important their product was to medieval society. Once you start getting into the Renaissance period, you see a declining interest in beer amongst the higher echelons of society, but it remained extremely popular amongst the middle and lower strata. One of the reasons beer remained popular throughout all strata for most of the medieval period, and even afterwards, owes to the nature and issues around wine production. Wine was largely controlled by monasteries and the church overall. They held considerable control over the access to the vineyards required to make wine, and for a lot of this period, the relationship with the church overall was something of a love-hate relationship, where the nobility would have a desire to ingratiate themselves, but also be resentful of the need to ingratiate themselves. The working poor would often be beholden to the monasteries, and as a result, they'd have some resentment as well. They also would not have ready access to wine through the monasteries and church. In fact, they'd largely only have access to beer they made themselves. This created an almost cultural phenomena in which the lower classes and upper classes consumed beer not only because of its ready access, but because it wasn't controlled by the religious elite. You might begin to see now why beer had such a big role in the European medieval period. It may not be the sole thing it had to do with, but between social, cultural, and practical issues, beer was an important thing and had a central role in the daily lives of the individual, no matter who they were. If nothing else, it gave them access to, if not the best quality water, at least water that was largely safe. It had some nutritional benefits as it contained sugar. It also allowed them to store it for a longer period of time. It could, if they made it in a large enough volume, also act as a tradable good, something they could barter. If you didn't have the necessary supplies from something, you could always trade with another person who did in exchange for beer. If you're interested in making beer or hops and barley, we have several videos on each of these subjects, and you'll find them either in the top right hand corner or in the description box below. Thank you for watching this video. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.